Welcome everyone here. We are just a number of groups that have been co-sponsoring this event, and our hope is that we could continue discussions about the effects of wars, both at home and also in future, the devastation that it has caused the people of Middle East, North Africa, and some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. So I hope we can have a good discussion, and afterwards we could go back home and have some concrete plans what to do next. And this is something that we need you guys to help us with. All right. And today is Father's Day. So I want to say Happy Father's Day for all the great dads who are here. I see some. So I hope you can enjoy your Father's Day with your children, with your spouse, and etc. All right. And okay, before we get to the panel discussion, I want to make an acknowledgement that I think is also on behalf of everyone here, which is that although we are focusing on the domestic costs of war, or the hidden costs of war, we all know that those who are suffering most are the people in that region. And, you know, the death being made, loss of infrastructure, millions and millions of refugees, so you name it. I mean, the troubles don't end, and it's not something that's going to go away for the next few generations. I hope not, but it seems like people would be still affected. So we have to keep them in our mind and our heart and do whatever we can do to expose all these crimes that have been committed in our names. Okay, so enough of that. And I also wanted to thank our panelists. I guess that's the first thing I should have done. So I just quickly introduce them. I bet you know them all. Morten Brussel, he's a physicist and specializing in nuclear science. He's Professor Emeritus, has written textbook on his specialty, and apparently he's been interested in world politics since he was a child, right? And then his interest became more and more in terms of anger rather than just interest after the Vietnam War happened, and it continues, and I bet he's probably the angriest ever right now. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. And what he's going to do is to talk about the administration's military budget, quote some like statistics, and also talk about the interconnectedness between this budget and all the budgets that came before these. And the profit motive, who's benefiting, who's not, how much politics is involved. So I'm very eager to hear him speak. And then we are honored to have Mariam and Rahim. She is the chair of Champaign County Democrats. Excuse me, there's just a lot of stuff she's involved with. She's a member of the Racial Justice Task Force, founding member of Sister Network, former director of A Woman's Place, former executive director of UOI YWCA, and a retired AFSCME union rep at large. My goodness. Yeah, and Mariam is planning to speak about the psychological effects on the veterans and their family, which is a very, very, oh my gosh, I don't need them, but right now I don't need them. These are warnings to you panelists. Yeah. And Augustus Wood, He's a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois. I don't know how he does this all, but he's also co-president of Graduate Employees Organization, co-president of Black Students for Revolution, co-host of World Labor Hour. Guess who?
Actually, he's a fellow host.
Oh, fellow host.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, pardon me. And he'll be examining the political economy both at the national level and then touching a little bit on how all the resources that go to war affects the working classes rather than being spent on meeting their needs, I assume. And David Johnson, he's the host of World Labor, co-host of the co-fellow of the World Labor Hour. He's with Jobs with Justice, Industrial Workers of the World, AFL-CIO, and I know personally that he is very passionate about our healthcare situation, and he's promoting, of course, the Medicare for all. So that's taking a lot of time out of his schedule, but for a very good cause. All right, so what we are going to, and he's going to talk about a lot of different things, but are related, right? Social, economic, well-being.
Focusing on infrastructure.
Infrastructure, okay. So basically how these wars have negatively affected our infrastructure. And also infrastructure overseas, right? But we are not covering that yet. All right, so I hope we have a good discussion, and then we have good comments, questions afterward. Because of the limitation of time and because I've talked so much, we have 10 minutes for each speaker to make their remarks, but that's not the end of it. And I try to be as strict as possible. Then we open up the floor to questions, and we hope to have some time to wrap up, but also sometime in between. I don't know exactly how we're going to do this, but I very much like the groups that are have been co-sponsoring this program and have tables here to be able to say just like a, I don't know, minute? Not half a minute, but a minute about their group. Right? Minute is two, yeah.
90 seconds.
90 seconds. Okay, you keep it. I cannot do it. All right. So without further ado, I'll ask Professor
I'm Martin Russell. So thank everybody for, can you hear? Let's see if I can read and speak into this microphone at the same time.
You want me to hold it for you? No, I can.
So I'm going to be mostly discussing our military budget, the Trump military budget in particular, the 2018 proposed budget. And my premise is that the principal reason for the strangling of our civil society is the budget, a principal reason. So the question is, why is it necessary? Why is this budget necessary? Why is it promoted? And why is it evil? So we consider the proposed budget and its presumed rationale. There are two components of the federal budget, a discretionary and a mandatory, essentially fixed part. Mandatory spending is about 2/3 of the total spending. The discretionary part of the Trump federal budget, as with the prior budgets, is presently dominated by the Pentagon and related expenditures. It includes virtually everything the government does outside of such entitlement expenditures as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Military expenditures include direct military spending and related spending on Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, CIA intelligence, and nuclear weapons research and development. It amounts to an astounding 68%, I'm talking about the Trump proposal, of the federal discretionary budget, 68%. You will find other numbers, but they're in that same range, 65%, 64%, etc. Borrowing some words from William Hartog, you undoubtedly won't be surprised to learn that perpetual war and the urge to perpetuate yet more of it leaves little room for spending on the environment, diplomacy, alternative energy, housing, or other domestic investments, not to speak of infrastructure repair. Put another way, preparations for and the pursuit of war will ensure that any future America is dirtier, sicker, poorer, more rickety, and less safe. With all the military spending and the increase planned by the Trump administration, the danger is that we shall forever be looking for new conflicts to engage in, to finding new enemies to scare our people. Is the United States really in danger from outside attack? So I'm talking about the rationale for our military enterprise. From China, Russia, Korea, Venezuela, Iran. Remember in this connection that United States military expenditures dwarf those of any other nation, are in fact larger than the sum of the next 7 countries' military expenditures, maybe 8 countries now. Russia's spending is about 1/10 of ours, and China's is about 1/3. We are surrounded by protective oceans and friendly countries. The only nations that could conceivably attack the US homeland are those which possess ICBMs, missiles, and air and sea power. In particular, our supposedly main adversaries, Russia and China. Iran and North Korea, now considered so dangerous and are therefore in our crosshairs, lack such capacities and are unlikely to have them in the near future, for they simply lack technical capacity and resources. They might, of course, use their diminished deterrent military capabilities were they to be targeted by the United States. In any case, what country would dare attack our nuclearized, high-tech military powerhouse? If they tried, they know that they would be obliterated by an overwhelming US response. This would be true even if our military budget were, for example, halved in half. Russia and China know this, and hence seek peaceful coexistence with the United States, despite threatening provocations by us. Another excuse for our military budget is to protect our allies, NATO, Japan, Israel, Saudi Arabia, South Korea. But there is little indication that those nations are in danger. That is, unless the United States initiates attacks on their neighbors. For example, an attack by the United States on North Korea might cause Japan and South Korea to be attacked. A US attack on Iran would invoke retaliation against Saudi Arabia and perhaps Israel. Therefore, it seems obvious what seems obvious is that we have this overwhelming military capacity mainly to safeguard our so-called, in quotes, national security interests. Turn the page. What this means is that we shall not readily tolerate competitors to those interests. We have to be able to require other nations to provide resources that we need or crave, such as oil. Moreover, we wish to be in control of those resources, physical and economic. Hence, that is the reason we maintain about 700 military bases around the globe at great expense. Our efforts to create what we call global stability means that we must repel resistance from other nations to our aims. We cannot admit the sovereignty of nations who, one way, their sovereignty one way or another? And what about using our military to fight terrorism? But it's well recognized that we create terrorists by our own destructive actions. Terrorism and a demonization of Russians, Chinese, Iranians, and others is useful in keeping our war economy running, servicing Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing, and others, and their subcontractors. These corporations are the obvious beneficiaries of our war-prone foreign policies. Yet high-tech weaponry has little effect on preventing attacks from terrorists. Of course, we must keep improving our already overwhelming military superiority because China and Russia and others are improving their military capabilities. Thus, an extra $54 billion in new military spending in the Trump budget and $1,000 billion over, I think it's 10 years, I'm not sure about that, to improve our nuclear weaponry as proposed, possibly for a first strike against Russia or China. It is now relevant and important to emphasize that the security of the United States, as conceived by our present administration, does not extend uniformly to its own population. The well-being of most of us do not only benefit from the gargantuan military budget, but are hurt by it. With a proposed Trump militarized budget, much of what most of our people value will be unattainable. Now consider the moral dimensions of U.S. policies. We have cast aside our supposedly core human values, the values of a humane, civilized society. Our behavior, wars, drone killings, subversions, is a grotesque tale of death, maiming, and destruction of other peoples and their societies. We've destroyed Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and perhaps others, while sustaining repressive warmongering theocracies like Saudi Arabia. Domestically, the military budget goes hand in hand with an increasing militarization here at home. National security regulations undermine freedoms. Nations dominated by militaries and their supporters become murderous and repressive. Remember how it worked in Hitler Germany, if you're old enough, Mussolini Italy, and Hirohito Japan. We must beware of heading in that direction. We must fight to reduce military and national security spending. I'll end here.
I wanted to direct your attention to the tables we have there from various groups, and there is one sheet that I have assembled, so I'm responsible for any mistakes that you can find in there, about various components of our military spending, which is not as obvious as one can see. It's hidden all over the place. So I've done as best of a job as I could have, but I'm sure that it's not accurate. So I really hope that you would get a chance to pick one of the flyers up and the other ones as well. Thank you so much. So please, Marianne.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I will speak on the psychological effects of warfare, and I will drill down. I'm not going to speak about it generically, because I'm going to speak about a population, because if we talk about it generically, we won't talk about populations that are not usually discussed when we talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome and other things related to the war. So what I will talk about this afternoon is that effect on two populations, specifically African Americans, and then touch on it briefly regarding women in the military. As African Americans, in regards to war, we've encountered and suffered many unbroken promises regarding our participation in the war. The most infamous two would be the American Civil War and the Vietnam War. So one of the, I won't belabor the history of the Civil War, but we all know that there was a call to arms for enslaved people and the secession states to join the war. And they did in resounding numbers. And post-Civil War, they suffered the same fate as all other free African Americans in the Reconstruction. That was heightened racism, lynchings, murders. So being a veteran in this country doesn't buy African Americans anything differently than other non-veterans. So again, we saw that in the Vietnam era because the country was deeply entrenched in civil rights movements. And veterans came back to face the same consequences that were present in the country. And I'll just give a little antidote for World War II because I had my parents and my father, his brothers, as well as my uncles on my mother's side. They were all in World War II. And they came back to, again, we know what the country looked like in the 40s and the 50s. In fact, if any of you, because we are not taught history accurately, probably most people in this room don't realize that German soldiers were housed in the South, kept prisoner in the South. And in my family, they tell stories of where they couldn't go in restaurants and white German soldiers were fed in those same restaurants. So again, we as a country have many broken promises to our African American veterans. So it brings us to our present state. Post-traumatic stress syndrome is probably one of the most widely known and discussed consequences of war, our present day war. It's resulted in disproportionate number of veterans being homeless, suffering from mental illness, and various things that are the byproducts of war. We're probably also familiar with recently the pushback that the Department of Veterans Affairs and the military in general got because of the stigma attached to veterans seeking mental health services. And so we even heard recently one of the top generals make the statement that those vets who needed that kind of care weren't real men, or they were not tough enough, and therefore that's why they needed mental health services. So we understand in the broader society there is a stigma, even for us who are non-veterans, in seeking mental health services. People think it'll affect their ability to get employment, and just any number of things that we as a modern society are not sophisticated and educated to the point that people feel comfortable getting mental health services without a stigma attached. So again, maybe and maybe not, people are aware of these issues that face African Americans coming back from the war. I think we're not, because when we look at TV and we hear about these things going on, it's never discussed in this country, despite the fact that race is a factor, always a factor. It's not necessarily always an issue, but it is always a factor. And we need to be honest enough to admit that. So when I started looking for some data to share with this group regarding services to African American veterans. On the Department of Defense website, the VA's website, there was very little information, very little. I was pleasantly or unpleasantly surprised, whichever way you want to interpret it, to find that due to this, there is an agency that started to address these particular issues for African American veterans. It's called Black Veterans of America. And again, the reasons that were stated for the need for this separate entity was the barriers to veterans receiving services. And they are, some of them are, distrust of a majority white system, including the VA, distrust of the federal government, fear of retaliation for disclosing feelings, few people, trusted people of color in the VA system, lack of culturally competent staff, and lack of culturally competent outreach. So some of these things that I discussed for African American veterans are also appropriate for female veterans in the military. They come back and face some of the same issues, as well as the fact that they suffer something differently in that they disproportionately also have suffered what we know to be as sexual harassment as well as sexual assault in the military. In fact, the military has created a phrase, they call it military sexual assault syndrome. I'm not sure why they would come up with such a phrase, but they do have that. And again, female veterans face the same kinds of issues. Ostracization, if they bring up the fact that they've been sexually harassed, let alone sexually assaulted. Being accused of being disloyal and unpatriotic, which of course, I guess, disagreeing with the government seems to be specifically reserved for Caucasian men, without having without being accused of being unpatriotic or disloyal. So, again, these are the barriers that prevent these particular groups from seeking the assistance that they need in order to rejoin the society. So that is my spiel, and I'm sticking to it. So I give him my extra.
Okay. I was surprised, so I'm glad you told me, so I didn't harass you.
Good afternoon, everyone. War, the most violent tactic for capital accumulation, leads to nothing more than the destruction of resources for the working and poor classes. Human capital, casualties, disease, displacement, starvation. Physical capital, land, institutions, and housing. And social capital, social networks, kinships, and other communal relationships due to anti-democratic suppression, repression, and neo-colonialist policies. Historically, if victory is achieved, the private spoils to the countries involved are the confiscation of resources such as territories, populations, labor, and other resources. Yet not only does war reduce aggregate resources for the masses, but the final distribution is generally different. Both the reduction in resources and their redistribution between the participants will lead to changes in social structure, space distribution, political economy, and factors of production. There are other internal indirect effects from war, such as food insecurity. This results from the disruption of the distribution channels or from a reduction in the income of the masses. There are also external indirect effects resulting from war. For example, the price of food increases for the non-combatant nations to a level where starvation and disease in their countries will ensue. If a warring country is a larger producer of agricultural products, then disruption in their supply of these products raises world prices. The adverse effect is created when the cost of a subsistence diet rises for the working poor in parts of the world. Additionally, the development of more destructive, disgusting weapons of war seems to have resulted in an increase in the social cost of war. When weapons were more primitive, casualties were generally confined to those directly involved in combat. As technology advances, so did the likelihood of casualty to the general population. The recent development of nuclear, biological, and drone warfare weapons has led to the cost of war now spilling over into the larger international non-combatant community of working class masses. The extreme example is the case of nuclear war, of course, where the possibility exists for the annihilation of a large fraction of the world's population. The more direct and current reality is drone warfare, escalated by the bloodthirsty Obama regime that killed over 3,000 people, with 80% of the murder being untargeted civilians in over 70% of the known world. Finally, there must be a realization that the economic consequences of war will likely imply changes to political, social, and civic institutions in these countries. Since economic policy is not derived in a vacuum, but instead formed within political institutions, there are horrific costs associated. The criminal seizure of resources by governments during war leads to a reduction in civil liberties, which in many cases persist into the post-war period. Freedom of speech and association are consistently revoked by governments, particularly the U.S., during times of war. Beginning with the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, the ruling class has instituted policies that curtail anti-war criticism and calls for democratic social change. In summary, since war generally leads to the redistribution of economic and political power, there arises the possibility that governments will adopt economic and social policies that impose such a devastating cost on society that it creates social crises that disorganize, subjugate, and exploit people. The socio-economic consequences of war are nothing short of mortifying. The U.S. has spent over $5 trillion waging wars since the turn of the century, and these costs continue to skyrocket. This data is quite appalling, from the over 1 million Iraqi lives lost to the U.S. invasion of 2003, to the more than 12 million refugees driven from just the 4 countries laid waste by the U.S. Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, and Syria. In addition, there are nearly 7,000 U.S. troops killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as 52,000 officially listed as wounded in combat, and the untold hundreds of thousands suffering from traumatic brain injuries like PTSD and other mental health problems resulting from multiple deployments in these imperialist-driven wars. It is also vital to make a serious and comprehensive evaluation of the real financial cost of wars. So let's get down to this. The overall cost of the U.S. imperialism war include the $1.7 trillion directly appropriated by Congress to wage them as so-called overseas contingency operations, OCOs. This is above and beyond the Pentagon's base budget, which totals some $6.8 trillion from financial year 2001 to 2016. By defining these wars as OCOs, Congress, together with both the Bush and Obama administrations, has acted if they are some kind of unforeseeable emergencies that could not be planned for within the government's normal budgetary process, even as they dragged out for a decade and a half. As a result, they were freed from any kind of normal fiscal accountability, with no taxes or other revenues allotted to pay for them. In addition to this direct war funding, we must include the cost of veterans' medical and disability care, allocations for homeland security, interest on Pentagon war appropriations, and future costs for veterans' care. This last cost is estimated at amounting to at least $1 trillion between now and the year 2053. The basis for such an estimate is made clear by the presentation of a few statistics. By the end of 2015, more than 1,600 soldiers who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan had undergone major limb amputations as a result of wounds suffered in combat. A total of 327,000 veterans of these wars have been diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries. And a Brown University report on the cost of war points out that Veteran Affairs is the fastest growing department in the U.S. government, with its staffing levels having nearly doubled since 2001 to 350,000 workers. Yet, according to another recent report, it still lacks sufficient funding to fill thousands of vacancies for doctors and nurses and to finance badly needed repairs to the hospitals and clinics, institutions. In addition to these costs, the report estimates that unless Congress changes the way that it pays for wars, even without their continuation, cumulative interest on war appropriations made just through financial year 2013 will amount to a staggering $7 trillion by 2053. The report also calls the Bush administration was preparing to launch the illegal imperialist war against Iraq. The administration's chief economic advisor, Lawrence Lindley, came under intense fire for estimating that the upper bound cost of the war reached between $100 and $200 billion. This estimate was roundly rejected by everyone from Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld to House Democrats, who put the figure at around $50 billion, which is now clear underestimated the real cost by a factor of 100. Reflecting in these wars, both in the criminality with which they were initiated and fought, and in the way they were funded, is this financial, parasitic, and socially destructive form of speculation that pervades the workings of American capital. By keeping the war costs off the books and relying on an all-volunteer military to fight them, the U.S. ruling class also hoped to dampen the popular hostility to militarism. This includes a full-blown media campaign in partnership with major corporations, particularly the NFL, to flood the masses with pro-war, pro-America propaganda consistently. As for effects on direct households, another report issued 2 years ago by Harvard University estimates that the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars amounted to $75,000 for every American household. Proletarian revolutionary Eugene Debs argued that the Republican and Democratic parties, or to be more exact, the Republican Democratic Party, represents the capitalist class in this class struggle. They are the political wings of the capitalist system, and such differences as arise between them relate to spoils, not principles. Working people must remember that they are all capitalists, and that the many small ones, like the fewer large ones, are all politically supporting their class interests. And this is always and everywhere the capitalist class, end quote. The elected officials of both major parties have continuously insisted that there is no money for jobs, decent wages, education, health care, and other basic necessities. There's no money for any of these things, while spending unlimited money on militarism, war, and the murder of black and brown people across the oceans, leaving the bill to be paid for through the intensification of austerity directed against the working classes. The human and fiscal toll wrought by the wars of the last 16 years are only a foretaste of the global catastrophe that is threatened as U.S. imperialism prepares for even larger wars under the Trump regime, with this military escalation focused ever more directly against Russia and China. As scholars, activists, and community leaders, we must revisit Debs' analysis of this Republican-Democratic oligarchy and understand it to be a neoliberal partnership in solidarity with each other to further late capital accumulation, and thus it is a futile tactic for social transformation. We have provided centuries for these political parties to align with the interests of the majority, and they have failed to deliver. So we must move on. As revolutionary Antonio Gramsci argued, we must invest our time and resources in building and sustaining alternative political organizations and cultural institutions that educate the masses and publicize our actual lived material realities under this current war state. Thank you.
Two expressions I want to start out with that have been said in the past. One is war is a racket, and the other is out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's really, if you look at, you think about why The United States, it seems like it's been continuous at war. I mean, at least in my lifetime, I think maybe 5 years. I'll be 60 in July, so 5 years of my 60 years, the United States has not been in some kind of war somewhere in the world. And the quote, "war is a racket," was said by Marine Corps General Smedley Butler in congressional testimony back in the 1930s, when he was talking about how, quote, he made Haiti safe for the Brown Brothers banking interests, and how he cleaned up Honduras and Nicaragua to benefit the United Fruit Company. Well, nothing's changed. It's the same thing going on today. It's just a little bit different, different parts of the world, different circumstances. And the other expression, "out of sight, out of mind," comes to mind, so to speak, because unlike when I was growing up during the Vietnam War, I was 7 years old when the Gulf of Tonkin happened, the supposed attack on a U.S. ship by North Vietnamese, which turned out, you know, I think 10 years later to be debunked, that it was a lie, a bold-faced lie, in fact. We saw every night correspondents that were allowed to go anywhere they wanted in Vietnam covering the war. The war was brought home to our living rooms. We saw firsthand. And of course, a lot of you people out in the audience who are older than I know much of this better than I, because I was still in grade school when this was going on, and a little bit in the middle school. But every night we'd see almost the war, the real reality of the war. Well, you know, working people like us, you know, we have to learn our lessons to better improve our society, but don't think the ruling class don't learn lessons too. And one thing they learned was that in these next coming wars, starting with Reagan in the 80s, but even more intensely with Bush II and the invasion of Afghanistan, and then later Iraq, was that they were going to totally control any information the American public saw, through TV images, newspaper, whatever. So I think that's why one of the big problems we face is that for most people, these horrible wars of destruction around the world, in the Middle East in particular, for profit. I mean, not to benefit, not to protect our safety. I mean, how many people here really do believe that all these wars we've been fighting since 2001 have made us safer, and that they're protecting us? Okay, it's the, you know, some people get very wealthy off of wars, directly from investments. But it's, you know, it also goes beyond that. It also goes to the control of resources, both natural resources like oil, and also sometimes control of labor costs. You know, if you can suppress a population, or like, if, for instance, my first mind comes to is Haiti and Honduras, to where they had a military coup in Honduras to get rid of a democratically elected president who wanted to raise the minimum wage just a few years ago. The United States government, Hillary Clinton's State Department denied they had anything to do with it. Well, that was debunked by WikiLeaks later on. So likewise, I mean, these wars are nothing but a way for the capitalist class in this country, the 1%, to enrich themselves and to control the world's resources and to dominate the world from any competitors. And it's us, working people like us, are the ones who suffer for this. You know, military spending, you know, it creates fewer jobs, dollar for dollar, because that's one thing you hear. You know, I've been a union member all my life, and I've been involved in the union movement, and there's so many national union leaders who defend this war spending because it creates jobs for the members, you know, particularly, you know, auto workers, machinists, other workers that actually, you know, make products for the war machine. But the thing is that these labor leaders just are too short-sighted to see that this is really harming the whole society as well, in the long run, their own members and themselves. And the thing is, military spending, I mean, it creates fewer jobs, dollar for dollar, than if it was invested in other sectors. I mean, 50% more jobs would be created for the same amount of money if it was in clean energy or healthcare, and double the number if it was additional jobs in education. I mean, since 2001, nearly $7 trillion has been spent on war-related spending for the expansion of the corporate empire. And the U.S. military has, and this is weird, I hear anywhere from 700 to 1,000 U.S. military bases. I can never get that figure, an accurate number on that. But even let's say the lower figure, 700 military bases around the world. And I think Russia has, I think, 4 or 5? And I think China has 2. I mean, is there really a need for this? If U.S. taxpayers knew how much they were actually spending for these wars and expansion of this empire, they'd want it in. I mean, so, you know, I think it'd be great if we had a clear and transparent war tax. If every American out there knew exactly how much they were paying to maintain these wars, I think things might change a little different. But as we know, out of sight, out of mind. So, you know, if you really want to focus, and what I want to kind of focus on is specifics, you know, stats on how this affects both our physical and our human infrastructure in this country. I mean, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, 1/3 of U.S. roads are in poor or mediocre condition. 30% of U.S. bridges are structurally deficient. 40% increase in mass transit spending is needed just to maintain the current U.S. transit system in the present condition it's in. And that's not even talking about possibility of the future of high-speed rail or mass transit connections to rural communities. If you live in a rural community, you don't have a car, it's extremely difficult to get to, say, a community the size of Champaign-Urbana or Bloomington-Normal. And in other countries, this is not the case. And in fact, even here in Central Illinois, between the 1890s and 1955, we had interurban rail, an all-electric rail system that started in Danville, came to Champaign, and then spurred off from Champaign to Bloomington and Peoria, to the northwest, and then to Decatur, Springfield, and as far as St. Louis in the southwest. So, I mean, don't tell me it can't be done. And there is definitely a need for it. 75% of our nation's schools, buildings, the school buildings, are inadequate to meet the needs of school children. And this does not even include the need for more teachers, more support staff, more technology, more equipment, more supplies. And in addition, 54,000 drinking water systems in this country face a shortfall of $11 billion needed to just upgrade or replace the existing facilities. And now this has reached crisis mode with Flint, East Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, and also stores in a lot of rural communities around the country. 16,000 wastewater systems need $12 billion in upgrades just to maintain to where they can do adequate water and waste filtration. 21,000 unsafe dams are needed in upgrades, and fixing these problems would be a huge economic stimulus. And in addition to this, you know, there's the human infrastructure needs that need to be taken care of. There's 3 million more Americans in poverty, 12% of the population since 2001. There's been a 100% increase in requests for emergency food assistance from U.S. cities, and half of those were not met. And that's another thing, is that this is not even including the food crisis in rural areas that is pretty much unreported. 33 million Americans, 10.5% of the population, still do not have health insurance, and a significant percentage who do have it cannot afford to use it, despite the Affordable Care Act. And this is not even mentioning the health care needs of veterans, both physical and psychological needs. And even those who have insurance, over 1 million medical-related bankruptcies and foreclosures happen every single year in this country. In addition, there's a student debt crisis. The federal and state regulatory commissions' budgets have been cut, like EPA's. Public school classroom sizes are increasing. State and municipal governments' budget deficits are increasing. Public sector and private sector pensions in distress, as well as Social Security in jeopardy. So it's not like we don't have the need. We desperately need these things done, and the war economy is basically cannibalizing our economy and sucking us dry. Thank you very much.
I mean, great discussion. Of course, this is just the beginning, right? I mean, there's just so much to cover. I think if we can just take a few minutes for our co-sponsors who have a table here to come up and just talk about 1 minute about their group and direct people to their table or their literature, that would be great. So we start with foods, not bombs. Just about, what you're doing and all your financial needs.
Yeah, of course.
Right? Need for donations.
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Food costs. Food costs.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank you guys for having this panel coming out. I think it's really excellent that this is happening. We're part of Food Not Bombs. There's Dara and Allison over there. Our table's back there, it's the one with the dirty green banner.
Keep the microphone closer to the mouth.
Yeah, of course, sorry, yeah. So this is our 5th week, I think, our 5th week of serving this week, so we're pretty new. Food Not Bombs is an international organization, basically like a big direct action protest movement about, talking about that we have basic needs that are not being met, but that money that the government should be spending on, food, making sure everyone can eat, is being spent on bombs. So food not bombs, basically, that's the whole thing. Right now, yeah, we do need money, but maybe even more than money, we still need certain materials to cook with and food to actually serve. Things like knives, certain containers, washing containers, all just really basic stuff to make sure that we can get our food out on time. We have some information on that table back there, including our banners about where we serve, which is at Westside Park at 6 p.m. Yeah, on Saturdays. So every Saturday, West Side Park at 6 p.m. We still, of course, need more volunteers, and we still need to get the word out so more people can come and eat. We really want our turnout to go up to maybe about 50 people by the end of the summer. And as far as volunteers to help cook, cook at your own house, bring food to us, donate cash, of course, so we could buy more food and materials, or donate those materials themselves. We have on our Facebook page, which is on our materials as well, we have a donation list of the things that we need. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Right? You have prepared something for this? You have prepared yourself for
Oh, no,
all
this is my
this?
notes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We also have
Yeah.
fruit, so if you want fruit,
Oh,
just take it from our
food.
table.
Right, food. And I'd like to ask the representative of Peace and Service Committee of Friends Meeting to come and speak a couple of minutes about what they do.
Hi, I'm Gotti Fiora-Weiss. I'm a member of the Urbana-Champaign Friends Meeting. It's great following Food Not Bombs. My mother, back in 1940, rode a mule onto the White House lawn carrying a sign that said, "Bread Not Bombs." So, I don't quite live up to that part of her role model. But anyhow, Quakers have been involved in anti-war activities for a long, long time. There's information on the back table about 2 organizations. The American Friends Service Committee was founded 100 years ago, partly to respond to World War I and provide direct service in the war-torn areas in Europe, and currently has projects around the country and around the world, both providing direct services and trying to increase community organization at the grassroots level, including working with youth and working with adults on a lot of the issues that we're all talking about. This edition of Quaker Action talks about primarily sanctuary issues, sanctuary everywhere. And we have, I don't know, half a dozen copies of it back there. It's also available online at afsc.org, and just look for the newsletter and look for other information about all of these subjects, including the war issues. There's another organization called the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Their website is fcnl.org. And this is part of a recent newsletter which, with the main article entitled, "More Bombs Won't Bring Peace." And it includes a lot of the information that was mentioned here also about the amount of money we spend on military issues. Back in, I think, 1960, our General President, Dwight Eisenhower, said, "Beware the military-industrial complex." Unfortunately, we haven't heeded that. He knew. And we know that money spent for war, a fraction, 2% of the money spent for war is spent for State Department and other things to prevent war. And we know that doing things to prevent war is a whole lot more effective than bombing people. So there's information back there. Please feel free to take it or look it up on the website.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to ask someone from Prairie Group of Sierra Club. I think Nancy? No?
Jump up, somebody.
Well,
I could say something.
yeah, yeah. I'm sorry if I caught you by surprise.
Well, first, just let me thank the panel. This was really good. And I'm with Prairie Group of Sierra Club. And as many of you probably know, Sierra Club is a national, state, and local group that is formed to protect the environment. And we're concerned about the environment being destroyed by war, and it also takes money away from doing things to protect the environment. So that's why we're here, and just really glad that you guys did this. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you have literature available? You have a literature available on your desk or not? No? Well, that's okay. People can go.
You can Google
contact.
Sierra Club.
Right. These days I forget about Googling what it does. Okay, so the next group, someone from Three Spinners to talk about the wonderful work they've been doing about the refugees in this community. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Megan with Three Spinners. So the stuff we've been talking about here is mostly the domestic impact of these global wars, but right now one, and I think it's every 114 people around the world is considered displaced, which is just astronomical. So in Urbana-Champaign, we have a thriving community of immigrants and refugees, many of whom are fleeing the things we've been talking about with the expansion of neoliberalism or these wars around the world. So Three Spinners was established to help support that community and also to help alleviate the kind of pressure valve of all of those displaced people around the world by helping to resettle folks right here in Urbana-Champaign. So one of our initiatives right now is to raise money for a family who will be moving here in early July. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, either donating your time, your energy, your resources, or your funds, we would greatly appreciate any interest or help you can throw at helping get these folks set up with a new life in a more safe and comfortable and welcoming community.
Thank you so much. I just want to mention that you should go to their website and read about where does the name Three Spinners come from. There's a great story behind it. So please do that. Okay, so Central Illinois Jobs with Justice. Who's gonna? Oh, what do you call it?
I will speak from the back. Hi, Jobs with Central Illinois Chapter of Jobs with Justice is a coalition of church and labor groups that are working for worker rights. We meet regularly the third Saturday of the month and work on a number of issues. So, David, do you want to say anything? David Johnson, do you want to add anything to this?
Well, just that, you know, if you're involved, either you don't have to be a member of a union, you can be a community group or a religious faith-based organization. It's basically a coalition, as Claire said, in the community to try to get economic justice for various people in the community. Last big thing we had, of course, besides giving solidarity support to unions that are in negotiations, there was the, I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the place, Guardian West factory in East Urbana, in which a lot of immigrant workers were being played off against so-called native workers and horrible working conditions. We had a campaign against them for quite a while, got a lot of media coverage. So that's what we've done in the past, and we'll continue doing things like that in the future.
Okay, equal justice, you have someone? Yes, please, thank you.
Hi there. I'm Lan Richard, co-director, along with my wife Pamela Richard, of the Equal Justice Collaborative. We are a small nonprofit, locally based. We work through education and advocacy to connect global issues with local action, or local action with global issues. Right now we have two campaigns going on. One is the cleanup of the coal ash along the middle fork of the Vermilion River, trying to get energy Midwest generation before they leave town to get their ash out of the river. That's, secondly, we're working in central and southern Illinois, starting another campaign along with other groups to help bring dollars from the Future Energy Jobs Act into central and southern Illinois, about $200 million a year to promote renewable energy economy, and more jobs. I want to make two acknowledgments. One, a lot of what we do deals with global climate change and addressing that. We also know that war has an enormous impact on the environment. It's something we discuss regularly and need to do more to address that. From the large, enormous carbon footprint of the U.S. military to the dollars that are drained, essentially stolen from issues for domestic development, infrastructure, as well as addressing the climate issue. It goes on and on and on. Poisoning of land, the resource wars are horrible energy policy that takes us into areas to exploit and to secure fossil fuels. That's an acknowledgement. The other is, I think, and we take maybe some blame for this too, I think if you go to most environmental organizations, go to their website, you see little to nothing about war and conflict. And it's something I think we need to change. We need to increase that dialogue. We need to get more exposure, because conflict, war, etc., has an enormous environmental impact, and we need to be able to address that and bring that to light. So.
Thank you so much. We'll start the Q&A, but is there any group?
Yeah, could I put in a plug for somebody?
Oh, yes, yes, that is not here. Right. I'm sorry, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah.
And where?
We could put in a plug for Aware too, yes. Okay.
So Harry Michelide, who couldn't be here this afternoon, he's a U of I physics grad student, and he has, I think, a really wonderful project. It's called STEM Strikes the War Machine. So STEM is for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. What he's proposing is a pledge for people who are involved in science, technology, engineering fields to refuse to work with the military-industrial complex. There are a lot of people in town who are involved in that. I'm one of them. So people work on counter-recruitment, on trying to prevent people from signing up to be part of military service. But it also takes a bunch of tech people to run a war machine, and if they're not participating, they can block it. So if you want to sign his pledge, there are forms at the back of the room. I wanted to put in a plug for the War Resisters League flyers. We have various, Yulfar and I have flyers about this with their analysis of how our tax dollars are spent. And counting the way how our income tax dollars specifically are spent. And by their measure, more than half of our income, our April 15th income tax dollars are going to the military. And obviously this is not new with Trump. The Trump administration is proposing a big increase, but it was already enormous under Bush, and it was already more enormous under Obama. So there's something about that at the back of the room. And I can put in a plug for a group that some of us are members of called AWARE, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. We're a local peace group. We've been around in one form or another since essentially just after the September 11th attacks, when people knew that there was going to be a reaction against that, and that reaction was going to include war making. So we have a weekly television program aware in the air, thanks especially to Carl and others. We have a farmer's market presence twice a month. We have monthly demonstrations on the Main and Neal corner in downtown Champaign, first Saturday of each month. We try to do a little bit of the role of education that Gus was talking about. So that's where.
Yeah. Yes, for people demanding action.
Yeah,
Okay. I just was going to exclude you.
People demanding action has a little corner down here. We have a flyer that explains the range of the issues we work on, which include stopping global warming, ending corporate rule, healthcare is a human right. We try to work outside the box and tie issues together because people staying inside their silos of one issue is how all the big picture things get missed. We have an action flyer because Tulsi Gabbard, Representative Tulsi Gabbard and Senator Rand Paul have introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. So I've put that out with the phone numbers of our congressmen and senators, and if people would take those, call them and harass them about that. And also, the lovely pink flyers are from Code Pink, and they're with Medea Benjamin, one of the best she was here, and organizations to, women's organizations to stop war.
I think we should open the floor for questions, and please be as concise as possible, as brief as possible. And if you want to address it to one particular panelist, please do so. Otherwise, whoever likes to respond, they can. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I have two brief comments. I'd like to recall what Senator Byrd said in response to George Bush in 2003 when he requested $1 billion to support the impending invasion of Iraq. And Senator Byrd said, "Mark my word," he said in front of Congress, he said, "Mark my word, $1 billion will be just the down payment."
Yep.
And we all felt, that's $1 billion for invasion. And the other comment I would like to make, the other comment is much of the PTSD that veterans experience when they return from the wars is a result of having to participate, or some of them voluntarily, in atrocities that our government and our troops are required to do.
Respond? No? Yeah? Yeah. Doing a great job. Right. And any question?
I see that Gus's shirt says organize. And I think that a lot of us would like to have a better way of getting the information together to organize, to respond quickly to things that are happening. Do any of you have suggestions of a next step, a method of communication, posting alerts that people can take part in so that it gets out more effectively to this community of people here and all of our networks?
Yeah.
That's Stuart. Our pieces.
Any suggestion for keeping us
He's the
all,
organizer.
keeping us connected?
One of the things that we often use too much for mobilization is, of course, social media. So there are things that, social media is a mobilizing tactic, but the one aspect that's missing from that is the relationship that needs to develop.
Yeah.
So that's why we have to organize. And organizing involves creating a connection with either another individual or a group of people, and it's usually around your lived conditions. So I take it that outside of posting things and information gathering, there needs to be some type of creation of some type of organization where people can get together and talk about these things and have education sessions about them. Not just somebody lecturing, but also having like a seminar type discussion about these things. And then also just going off of that, there needs to be more research being done in relation to the local struggle of anti-war. I'm sure that AWARE has some really good resources since they've been so active for so long, but there are also other resources, particularly in Champaign-Urbana and in the statewide struggle against war and against the resources being taken away. So, I mean, we really need to know, like, what exactly is the food insecurity percentage in this particular area? What is the housing crisis in relation to the one that's going on in Chicago? So there are ways to link around certain issues that if we form this group and we delegate tasks to do the research and form our struggle around that particular information, because we're forming the interests and realities of the people there, then we can actually build it even bigger. So again, that's an initial step that we could possibly make in terms of not sharing ideas and information, but also building relationships. That's more important than the information, because it's easy to get that. It's very difficult to build resistance. So that's what we need to be focused on.
Right. So when are you going to come over to your house?
When I get
connection.
I won't ever own a home, so I don't.
I just want to make a comment that one of the difficulties of the 1% program was that it didn't have leadership. And I think leadership, which has standing and which can be on the media, is extremely important. I think that Bernie Sanders, even though he may not like a lot of the things that he was for, he illustrated the fact that he was a politician, therefore he could get onto the airwaves, on television. That was an organizing principle, and of course, people were interested and enthused by what he was saying. One of the things that's deficient in our society now is that we have leaders, representatives, who are not at all representing what most of us want. And so there's a fracture of democracy in this country right now, and somehow I hope that something wells up, that there will be politicians who will take on the roles and the values that we're talking about here.
Just real quick though, I understand what you're saying, but one of the things that we have to be careful about is the pitfalls of vanguardism. We've allowed elected leaders to hold the interests of the people now since the conception of this country, and they failed many times. And I'm a very much an anti-vanguardist. I believe that if we build something collectively, and we're all servant leaders of our particular organizations and communities, then we can start to rebuild some of these cultural institutions from the ground up that can challenge the dominant narratives, like the education system, the media. We have the public eye. We have AWARE on the air. We have the World Labor Hour. We have drums for Black Central Revolution. We got all these different alternative sources to challenge dominant narratives, and they're all mostly based on socialist principles that don't necessarily have a leadership, but have people delegating tasks and sharing responsibilities and building those types of networks. So again, I do understand that there are roles to where some people have to be in front of cameras or they have to do interviews and act as a leadership entity, but we don't want to fall into the pitfalls of icons and vanguardism to save us from this oppression, right?
Just to add to, as far as the information, there's a sign-up sheet in the back for the AWARE Peace Discuss list if you'd like to get on that, because there's constantly articles and various information coming across that.
Okay, yes, please.
In almost every presidential campaign, certainly those I remember in my lifetime, both candidates in the major parties would talk for more military spending. It was immensely popular. And indeed, many polls would say that the military is among the most respected institutions in our country. So why is military spending popular, and why is the military so trusted if all of us are against war?
Good question. Good question. Very good question. You know, that's one of the most uncanny aspects of our history, and it goes back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. You know, when the United States' first foreign policy comes about, their major push is in the interest of the national security, right? So to push that type of foreign policy in 1823, when the U.S. was still kind of young, one of the things that they would do is they would have to control the narrative to the masses of people, right? And so when you look at one of the biggest instances of this with the Spanish-American War at the end of the 1800s, right? And you had that yellow journalism for this idea that we are being attacked, we are being provoked, they are disrupting our national interests and putting the safety of the people at risk. This isn't just, what I'm trying to say is that this isn't an isolated way that the neoliberals or the capitalist class dominates the cultural institutions. They use the church, they use education, they use the media to promote this idea that if you are not abhorred by what these people have been doing to Americans, then there's something wrong with you. It's an ostracizing and disorganizing tactic that is very reactionary in character. It's what they've always done, and they've always been able to fixate it around a particular instance. Same thing with Vietnam when it first started. Same thing with September 11. Same thing with World War I and World War II. That there has to be a popularizing to the masses of what this is all about. But you always have those group of resistance there that say, no, 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 trying to educate, holding alternative media in terms of newspapers, radio shows back during the 40s for World War II, etc. So there's always that counter-hegemonic presence there. But we have to make sure that we give credence to the fact that there is a structural process of making sure that war and military in America becomes this exceptional, iconic figure that you must defend at all costs, no matter what is going on at the time. So in other words, to answer your question, it's a historical practice that is usually adopted in different ways by different administrations.
And deep cultural roots.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I won't disagree with that, but I think it is a historical process. Andrew Basovich has just written an article about the new American militarism, and he points out various things. There was the frontier culture, for example, which is part of our growing up, and you know, we conquered the West. There was the World War II, which was recognized by almost everybody as a great success for the United States against Nazism and fascism. We're pervaded. Okay, militarism is so pervasive in this society that there's no one who is willing to stand up against it in the public media, because, I mean, if you write a letter to the News Gazette and saying that, you know, we don't want any war expenditures, or we're against, I hate to say it, we're against the fact that veterans exist. If there were no people going into the military, we wouldn't have veterans, we wouldn't have all the problems associated with what those people did during the wars. So the fact that you have a big veterans organization is another thing which biases people's opinions about the military. Anyway, just go ahead.
And you say, why are we against the war? Actually, we are not against wars. Because whenever there is a rallying for a war, the masses or the majority do not respond to that in a way that says we should not engage. So I think kind of passively leaving it to our leadership to decide when and where we invade, it does not mean, just not in any way suggest that we are against wars.
Response.
Okay. I guess I was just going to speak to, well, my question was more about like strategy in general. I think since the Bernie campaign, it's pretty clear that there's a large and perhaps growing number of people who are extremely disenchanted with I mean just either the mainstream of the Democratic Party or the Democratic Party as a whole, and I mean people on the left who are or who have what we might consider left-wing points of view, and so I guess I want to throw that out there, and then I think to Gus's point about vanguardism, I think it's a slightly more complicated issue. We might have there are different definitions of what vanguardism is, but if this is an anti-war panel, I mean, most of the successful anti-war movements in history were, I mean, they were led by the working class, but there was a vanguard party that so like the Russian Revolution was probably the most successful anti-war movement in history. You know, World War I ended in 1918, the year after the Russian Revolution, because of revolutionary movements throughout Europe. Germany, the Kaiser was forced to abdicate the throne. Obviously, the Tsar and his family were killed by the Bolsheviks. So, and then of course the Vietnam War. I mean, probably the best example of what could be called a vanguard during the anti-Vietnam War movement would have been the Black Panther Party. Yeah, so I just want to like put that out there as like there's a lot of groups today, small Marxist groups that think that call themselves the vanguard, and you could define vanguardism in that way, like you're calling yourself a vanguard when you're really not, and then there's actual historical examples of parties that call themselves vanguard, that they had actual mass roots in the working class and in the masses of people. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of put that in.
Just to add on what you were saying about like an organized leadership basically for anti-war.
Vanguard is about elected leadership.
Right. I mean, one problem that comes to my mind is that Martin Luther King was popular up to the moment that he started to criticize the Vietnam War. Even some of his allies within the civil rights movement or other anti-war movement came mostly afterwards, but people were really upset with him. I mean, not just the liberal media like New York Times attacking him, Washington Post attacking him, but his people abandoned him, basically. And we have to really think about this very hard and look inside ourselves. Another example that I have is that when we had the Women's March in Washington, all sorts of topics were discussed, and there were, posters, opposing various policies of the previous governments and this government. But at least I don't remember having seen a strong anti-war opposition being expressed by people there. So all of this should make us think about what is it about wars that make us willing to give up our freedoms and our welfare, well-being, and even, during Vietnam, also sacrifice the lives, right? There is something that I guess needs to be talked about.
Can I answer that question? Real quick? What Jesse said? One thing that's unique about us here in the 13th U.S. Congressional District is that we don't have any military bases or any major war profiteer contractors, which makes us sort of unique, because that's a lot of time is how the military-industrial complex will ensure that they have no opposition, because they always thought, well, there's 5,000 jobs in your district, these people are going to lose. So, that's the one good thing we have going for us here. This comment.
You got a lot of people.
I just have a quick question. I know that many of you are working diligently in the community with grown-ups. I know for a fact that in Bloomington, on a daily basis, the military has a lunch table at which they attempt to recruit.
Yeah.
What organizations are going into the high schools to be a counter-presence? That's my question.
You have an answer to this question?
I have an additional.
Okay, so maybe the next. Do you have any information about, I remember that it used to be in our community, people going to high schools to do like counter recruiting and talking about, all the lies that those young people were told about, patriotism, about the way that they would improve themselves in life. But I don't know, I just haven't heard of them.
No. So what came to my mind in the last 6 months, in the last year, was something I can't believe that's going to come out of my mouth. And I think maybe we have to have a draft again.
Oh,
yeah.
Because I teach dual credit at Parkland College. I love my students. And my students are particularly focused in health careers. But it seems that there's still a sub-aggregate of that population that perceive they have no jobs for them. And so I'm becoming alert that these young people, women and men, feel that the military service is their way to financial security, and it's very alarming. It's very alarming. I was a public health nurse for 18 and a half years. I facilitated all the homeless clinics in Champaign-Urbana, and talk about PTSD and a plethora of mental health issues that do not get addressed in appropriate ways. Thank you so much.
okay, all right. Yeah, and thank you so much. These are issues that we need to work on.
So, to your point, disproportionately low-income citizens enter the military. And so, so again, to your point, when there was a draft, at least there was a pretense of everybody getting a turn. So that you did, there had to be a concerted effort to get excused by using influence and money and power, but at least in that particular configuration, there was the pretense that everybody was supposed to serve in the military. Doing war or peace.
Right. And our service people don't have that history anymore.
And so the all volunteer military in this country has resulted in disproportionately low-income families sending their kids to the military or suggesting it as a way out when the community has no jobs to offer. So that is actually a fact. How to address that, I would imagine, would be something that we would have to take up with our elected leaders. And so that should give us all pause. That should give us all pause, something to think about. Again, the whole class structure in this country, which is not talked about hardly ever.
That's true. In regards to going back to the draft, I remember at the start of the Iraq War, Ramsey Clark came to town to speak against the war, and I got up very naively and said that if you want to prevent this war and future wars, you should reinstate the draft.
Oh man.
And everyone was angry at me. I mean, most of the people were anti-war people, but even Ramsey Clark also spoke against this, saying that even in that kind of situation, people who would end up going to war are the poorer people, because the kids of the senators or all those wealthy people would get away with it. But look at what the situation we are in now. Right. Well, I guess you need to. Yes.
This can be quick. How readily does violence around the world lead to violence against oppressed nations in the U.S.?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, how much the violence that is perpetrated by us.
Maybe you should answer
across
it.
I shouldn't say us, I'm sorry. Yeah. No, yeah. How much of that contributes to the violence that is being perpetrated here, like in prisons or the police, etc., right?
Yeah.
It's a direct.
Or just maybe homicide and stuff?
Well, I was specifically referring to like oppressed nations like Native Americans, African Americans.
Oh, I see.
Latinos,
Okay.
People who might
I'm sorry.
constitute like a different ethnic group than the majority white population.
Right.
Imperialism is directly linked to the militarization and murder of peoples of color in this country, particularly low-income people in low-income spaces. I mean, you go back in history with Native Americans. You already mentioned that as well. But in a more recent example, of course, that we've seen the militarization of the police skyrocket following the 2008. First we saw a push for militarization following the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, but the real push came as people started standing up against those wars and resisting, and also resisting some of the other financial terror that was being put upon peoples. And you start seeing them, especially after the Great Recession of 2008, you saw a push more for militarizing the police in local areas then. So again, you cannot separate what happens in the political economy with what happens with the militarization or the pro-police thing, the pro-police propaganda and actions and policies from the state and federal level. So those things are definitely intertwined. And as you saw the rise of bodies across seas, you see the rise of bodies here as well. Like there is this push to create this structure, and all of this tied directly to neoliberalism. Because in the theory of neoliberalism, you have to repress and suppress any type of ideas of democratic calls for social change, right? So you have to be, so in other words, it's a very reactionary measure to create these forces to kill and surveil. That's a very important aspect of it too. We're not just going over there and killing folks. We're surveilling their people for our exploitative reasons. So we have to put that in there as well. You can directly correlate how the police surveil cities here in working class and black areas, black and brown areas, with what happens in overseas as well. And again, you look at that chart, 2008 specifically, you see that relationship. So yes, they are directly intertwined. And we must always make sure that when we educate, we talk about those links internationally and nationally.
Right. And you had a question?
Yeah, well, I had a quick
or comment.
Yeah.
Yes.
So coming up next year, as all of you are probably aware, is the vote is coming up for Congress. And so that's the way that we can address a lot of these anti-war things, is try to put pressure on politicians and try to get more people out to vote. And as probably everybody already knows, is that there's a lot lower turnouts in like these congressional races, and especially primaries. And so like your vote has the most use during a primary. And I'd like to see us be able to bridge the gap of people that vote in a general election compared to the people that vote in a primary. There's like a huge number of people that just aren't voting. And could we mobilize those votes in some way to put pressure on politicians to do
What's
more
going on in
anti-war?
Georgia as we speak?
Oh, yeah.
So I think that would be an excellent way to organize people, organize them to vote for politicians. That's the one thing that politicians hear are votes. So when people stay home, there's a lot of people staying home, like young people, young people are very anti-war typically. And I mean, like the Bernie Sanders folks are all young people typically, or I mean, a lot of them. So getting those people out to actually vote for congressional races and vote for local elections, I think that would be excellent.
Have you actually considered why people are staying home?
I don't know if any research has been done in it.
There's been a lot of research done on why people are disenchanted with this system, because we continuously vote for people who claim to have our interests. We pour out money, we walk, we knock doors, and these people get into office and they continuously disregard our interests.
Well,
We're tired of doing that.
We need to vote them out.
Because we've been doing it for centuries. We've been giving them a chance for centuries to look at the material interests of the people, and they continue to fail. There is no way that we can go in good heart and tell people to vote for somebody, a billionaire like J.B. Pritzker, versus another billionaire like Bruce Rauner, versus more billionaires.
There's more options than that. We should run candidates. The voting is the only way to get them out of office.
This structure does not allow multiple candidates to flood the political parties. You know that. Come on. The Democratic and Republican oligarchy controls the political process. There's no way that they can flood that. We need a new political system. That's what we need to be organizing around, and not knocking doors for a candidate who's going to spit in our face. Oh, excuse me, they're not going to stab us as quickly as Rauner will. They'll slide the knife in slowly.
There are options. There's a school teacher that's running for governor. There's a lot of people, and if you're saying that we shouldn't vote, I don't think that's a constructive way of.
I didn't say we shouldn't vote. I'm saying that's a menial tactic instead of organizing the people. It's a waste of resources.
Organize them to vote. Organize the vote.
But you can't stop
You should read the history of social movements.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to respond to Sandra's comment about counter-recruitment. So one of the great things about the Trump administration is that it's really activated a lot of groups who otherwise probably wouldn't try to get activated. So I've heard, for example, there's a socialist alternative group trying to get active here. I went recently to a sort of initial meeting of Socialist Party USA locally, and one of the things they were talking about was one of their national projects is exactly that, counter-recruitment. You know, they sort of encourage this, that's one of the things they would encourage local groups to do. They were talking in terms of the war industry. I think this is really great. I don't know how many other groups there are like this. And they're not, you know, as far as I understand, they're mostly not trying to engage the political system directly. They're not like trying to run candidates. They're trying to organize people and to find good things to organize around, but not organizing just around only a particular issue, but try to think of themselves as some sort of a party. So, awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, locally we have People's Agenda. I mean, they try to encourage young people, you know, people who have never been into politics to run for local offices. And, you know, one can scrutinize, you know, their tendencies, their ideology, and see whether we can support them or not with their campaigns. But what they're gonna become afterwards, that's the $1 million question. And you talked about socialist groups. Yes. Sure. I wanted to, John, can you talk about the democratic socialist? Sorry.
I want to point out that we have a person that represents Champaign-Urbana, who is black and who came up poor and who has represented us very faithfully. And the turnout for her election was amazing, and a lot of people worked very hard on her campaign. So she's thinking of running for Congress. I'd like her to see her stick a couple more years with the state legislature so we can get that straightened out and then run for Congress. But when we have candidates like that, she has not spit in our face. She has faithfully represented us. She is working for the people. So it is possible, but it takes a lot of work and it takes a really good candidate.
Right. Absolutely. All right. So, I mean, we went over time. I'm glad I reserved the room till 3:30. But thank you everyone for coming, and please let's stay in touch and try to organize.